James Carter liked his mornings quiet. A coffee on the back porch, the soft hum of the neighborhood waking up, maybe a bark or two from the golden retriever next door. But that morning was different. He heard the hammering before he saw it. Sharp, metallic thuds, a rhythmic assault coming from above his head. At first, he thought it might have been from a nearby house. So he stepped outside and found a crew of men on his roof, ripping shingles like they were peeling an orange dot. James blinked. Then again, this had to be a mistake. He crossed the lawn and waved up at the workers. One of them looked down, confused, but kept working. James raised his voice. The response came casually from the man standing near the ladder. HOA approved. It. Talk to them. James narrowed his eyes. Approved what? Roof violation, said yours didn't match the neighborhood standard. We're replacing it. You'll get the invoice. James's pulse ticked upward. He hadn't requested any work. There was no notice, no permit. He backed up, reached for his phone, and called the HOA office. No answer. Typical. 15 minutes later, James walked across the street. Karen Whitmore lived in the largest house on the block, vinyl siding, fresh paint, a flag out front, and a yard sign that read, "Protect our property values." She answered the door like she'd been expecting him. "You're welcome," she said with a smirk. James stared. "You sent a crew to rip off my roof. It's non-compliant. Solar panels installed at an angle not consistent with community visual harmony. Violation of Section 12.3 of the Aesthetic Code." "You mean the solar panels I got approved 3 years ago? With permits?" She smiled wider. "Well, the board reviewed it again, and we voted. It's out of harmony now." James tried to keep his voice calm. "You didn't even notify me. We posted the violation on your door last week. There was no notice. You can't just send people onto my property without permission." Karen stepped forward. "Actually, under Emergency HOA, Action Clause 7, we can authorize immediate corrections if a visible hazard is deemed present." "A hazard? To who?" "To property values." James shook his head, already walking back toward his house. Something felt off. Karen had always been strict about rules, but this was a different level, something personal, and far more reckless than usual. He stared at the roof already stripped on one side, and then at the panels. Each had a small serial tag, placed during installation under a state renewable energy grant. The funding had come through a pilot program James had applied for, mostly to save on his utility bills. But now he remembered something the installer had said, almost offhandedly. Ownership of the panels, technically, belonged to the state for 10 years. Maintenance and alteration had to be cleared through Sacramento. James stopped cold. Karen hadn't just ordered unauthorized work. She may have unknowingly vandalized state-funded infrastructure. A truck pulled up. His friend Stacy stepped out. She worked at the state's Green Energy Initiative. He'd called her the moment the roofers showed up. James filled her in. She examined the site, took pictures, asked questions. Her face shifted from puzzled to concerned. "This is bigger than an HOA thing," she said. "Those panels, they're part of a state pilot test. Removing or tampering with them is a direct violation of the state energy code." James looked back at Karen's house. The blinds twitched. She was watching. Stacy made one last note. "You'll need to file a report, and I'll escalate this. If she authorized it, she's in serious trouble." As the sky darkened with the threat of rain, James stood in his yard, half his roof gone, water damage imminent, and now, possibly, the beginning of something that would shake the entire HOA to its core. And Karen? She had no idea what she'd just done. By the time James filed the report with the state, clouds were rolling in over the neighborhood like slow-moving bruises. The temperature dropped. A storm was coming. He stood in his garage, boxers pushed to one side, a leak bucket already catching water from the exposed section of roof. He reviewed the documents twice before submitting. Stacy had helped him word it carefully, just facts. Date, time, unauthorized removal, identity of the HOA president who ordered it, and the serial numbers of the solar panels now sitting in a pile beside his driveway like discarded junk. Across the street, Karen Whitmore's porch light was on. She hadn't come outside since their confrontation, but he'd seen movement behind her blinds. She knew something was coming. James didn't care if she did. That roof wasn't just his anymore. And now, she was about to learn exactly who she'd picked a fight with. The next morning brought drizzle and mud tracks across his yard, where the roofing crew had bailed halfway through. No sign of them now. They hadn't finished, hadn't returned, and hadn't billed him, probably because they'd figured out that they were in trouble. James received a call just before noon. A state official, formal in tone, said an energy enforcement investigator was being dispatched. James nodded, keeping his voice steady, though a part of him buzzed with quiet satisfaction. Karen had called his bluff, and lost. The doorbell rang that afternoon. A man in a dark suit and windbreaker introduced himself as Richard Dean from the California Energy Protection Division. He asked to see the damage. James led him through the garage, up into the attic, and finally to the panels outside. Dean didn't say much. He snapped photos, took measurements, and asked specific questions about the installation timeline. James had all the receipts, permits, even an approval email from the department's own contractor. Then came the part James had been waiting for. Dean closed his notebook and said, "Do you have any documentation showing this action was authorized by you?" "I have documentation showing it wasn't," James replied, and handed over a copy of the HOA's correction order. The one Karen had slid under his door after the fact, dated that very morning. Dean read it twice, then said nothing. "Let me guess," James offered. "That order wasn't enough." Dean nodded slowly. "No, sir, not even close." They both turned when a voice cut across the lawn. Karen stood near the sidewalk, arms crossed. She'd been waiting for her moment. "Excuse me," she called out. "Can I help you with something?" Dean introduced himself calmly, but Karen didn't flinch. "Yes, I know who you are. I called your office, actually. You see, Mr. Carter has been in repeated violation of our HOA architectural guidelines, and his solar equipment was unsightly and improperly installed." James didn't interrupt. He watched Dean's expression, unmoved. "The HOA has full authority to make emergency corrections to exterior violations," Karen continued, "especially if the homeowner refuses to comply." Dean flipped a page in his binder. "Do you have copies of permits for the work?" "State-level clearance to modify equipment funded by the Renewable Energy Pilot." Karen blinked. "Excuse me, I'm asking if the HOA cleared this action with the California Green Energy Office prior to altering infrastructure still under state ownership." Karen's mouth opened, closed. Dean stepped forward. "Because, if not, then this incident isn't just a neighborhood matter. It becomes a potential violation of California Civil Code 2861F, which covers state renewable property interference." Karen recovered slightly. "We followed our protocols. If Mr. Carter failed to notify us about state ownership, that's on him." Dean held up a photo of the serial tag from one of the panels. "Each of these is clearly marked as stately. Removing them without authorization is a Class C violation." Karen's cheeks flushed. "I'll have to refer this to our legal committee." "That won't be necessary," Dean replied. "The complaint has already been escalated, and any further obstruction may increase liability." Karen turned without another word and walked back to her house. Her shoulders were tighter than before, her pace quicker. James didn't smile, not yet, but something had shifted. Karen had always been the one with power. Till now, Dean packed up his camera and clipboard. "You'll hear from our department in a few days," he said. "But between you and me, I wouldn't be surprised if we take action sooner." That night, James sat by the window as the rain came down. Every drop that hit the tarp-covered hole in his roof echoed like a drumbeat. Across the street, Karen's lights stayed on long past midnight. The balance of control had begun to tilt. But James knew better than to think she'd give up that easily. Karen wasn't finished. She was just getting desperate. 3 days passed before anyone from the HOA made contact again. No apology, no explanation. Just a formal notice slipped into James Carter's mailbox, folded once and sealed in a cheap envelope. It read like a ceasefire written in crayon. The document claimed that the HOA regretted the inconvenience caused by the corrective roof maintenance and would offer a partial reimbursement, provided James withdrew all complaints filed with the state and agreed not to pursue legal action. There was no mention of damage, no mention of the solar panels now rusting near his garden, no mention of Karen Whitmore. James didn't respond. He didn't need to, because by then, things had already moved beyond his reach. On the evening of the fourth day, a black sedan with state plates parked outside his home. Stacy stepped out, umbrella in hand, flanked by the same investigator, Richard Dean. This time, they weren't here to observe. James met them at the porch, and they all walked across the street together. Karen's porch light flickered to life before they even knocked. She opened the door before they could reach it. Her smile was sharp and thin, more survival than courtesy. "I was just drafting a response to your department," she said to Dean, as if their arrival had been expected. Dean didn't smile. "This isn't a social call." They stepped inside. The living room was spotless, the furniture stiff and untouched. Framed family portraits lined the mantel. Everything about the space felt curated, controlled. Karen motioned toward the couch. Dean remained standing. "We've completed our internal investigation," he began. "The solar array removed from Mr. Carter's property was part of a state-monitored energy test. The terms of that program prohibit any modification by entities, which the HOA in this case qualifies as." Karen didn't blink. "We were unaware of that clause. And frankly, it should be the responsibility of the homeowner to disclose such matters before erecting equipment that violates neighborhood harmony." James Carter followed every legal step. Stacy replied, "Your board's actions were unauthorized, and they caused material damage." Karen's smile cracked for the first time. "We acted in good faith." Dean reached into his folder and pulled out a copy of the HOA's own violation report signed by Karen, dated 2 weeks after the original work was done. "You acted in response to something that wasn't even filed yet," he said, "and now the state is evaluating civil liability." Karen stood stiffly. "You'll be hearing from our attorney." "We're certain we will," Dean said. "But until then, the HOA is under order to halt all enforcement actions on Mr. Carter's property, effective immediately." Any further interference will result in additional penalties. He turned, but paused at the doorway. One last thing. The roofing crew you hired. They've already turned over documentation, including the written order you signed instructing them to remove all energy hardware, regardless of permit status. Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. That night, a quiet spread over the neighborhood like fog. Windows stayed shut, curtains drawn. Everyone had heard something. Whispers moved from porch to porch in half sentences and sideways glances. The president of the HOA had been visited by the state, not just spoken to, not just warned, investigated. James didn't bother watching. He had work to do. With the state's temporary clearance, he began clearing the debris and prepping for a proper repair. He called the original solar contractor, who agreed to reinstall the panels once the roof was replaced in the state's dime. But even as James cleaned up the wreckage, he noticed something strange. A neighbor, Janet, from 2 doors down, walked her dog past his yard and offered a slow, hesitant nod. Then another neighbor waved awkwardly from a parked car. James was no longer just the guy with the cool roof. He was becoming something else in their eyes. A problem. A precedent. Proof that someone could go up against the HOA and win. Inside Karen's house, lights flickered late into the night. She was quiet, yes, but not retreating. People like her didn't fold. They regrouped. The real move James suspected was coming next, and it wouldn't come through official channels. It would be quieter, personal, and much harder to prove. The neighborhood felt colder, not because of the weather, but because of the silence. James Carter had lived on Willow Bend for nearly 7 years. He knew the rhythms when the mail arrived, who always mowed their lawn too early, which porch lights never turned off. But after the visit from the state officials, something subtle changed. Neighbors who once smiled and waved now looked away, a second too soon. Conversations stopped when he walked by, and the HOA newsletter, usually just announcements and landscaping reminders, now included a carefully worded piece about disharmony caused by homeowner state entanglements. It didn't mention James by name. It didn't have to. Feel Karen's fingerprints all over it. It was clear she was regaining her footing. Not through legal means. She'd lost that battle, but through the slow tightening of social pressure. An old tactic, used by every HOA president who knew that control wasn't always about power. Sometimes it was about isolation. Still, James kept to his plan. He focused on restoring what was his. The new contractor arrived, sent by the state, and immediately began repairing the damaged section of his roof. New tiles, new sealant, reinforced support beams. The only thing missing were the solar panels, which had to be reapproved before reinstallation. It was during one of the roof inspections that James noticed something off. He was reviewing photos on his phone before and after shots for the state's insurance file when he spotted something strange. One of the photos taken just after the panels were removed showed a small, round object stuck between the roofing slats. It looked like a metal tag, out of place. He zoomed in. It wasn't just debris, it was a sensor. James climbed up that afternoon and checked the area himself. And there it was. A discreet little device nestled beneath the insulation line. His heart beat faster, not just because it was unfamiliar, but because it didn't belong there. He took it down carefully and examined it. The back had a serial number, but no brand. And when he powered it, a tiny red light blinked for a split second before fading out. James wasn't a tech expert, but he wasn't stupid. He called Stacy. 2 hours later, she confirmed it. It's a geo-tracking tag, she said, after scanning it with a device from her department. Commercial grade, used for property asset monitoring, but this isn't issued. Stared at the tag, then at his half-finished roof. Someone planted it, he said. But why? Stacy shrugged. Could have been meant to track who serviced the panels. Or maybe someone wanted to know if you were using unauthorized tech. Could have even been from a third-party contractor. But if it's not ours, it was placed without your consent. James didn't need to think hard. There was only one person in the neighborhood who had the motivand access that night. He walked his property perimeter, checking every corner, and sure enough, behind a bush near his driveway, he found another device, smaller, tucked into a patch of mulch. It wasn't transmitting. Stacy had given him a detector, but it was enough to prove a pattern. Karen hadn't just sent roofers. She'd turned surveillance on him, whether to gather false violations or build a case for the board. She'd gone too far, and James now had physical proof. He knew he couldn't just confront her outright. That would lead nowhere. She'd deny it, twist the narrative, and possibly accuse him of tampering with HOA property. No. If James wanted to stop her for good, he had to think like her. Use the system. Use the very rules Karen loved to enforce. He spent the next 3 days compiling everything: photos, timestamps, recorded conversations, witness statements from the contractors. And now, to found tracking devices. And then he contacted someone he never thought he'd need, the county property investigator, not code enforcement, not small claims. A division that dealt with civil rights violations on private property. By the time the sun set that evening, James had filled out the first set of formal complaints. Karen had declared a quiet war. He was going to finish it loud. The county office didn't take long to respond. James Carter's complaint triggered a quiet stir within the civil enforcement branch. Tracking devices planted on private property, especially without disclosure or legal purpose, was a serious breach. Within days, an investigator from the county arrived on Willow Bend Drive. Her name was Camille Ortiz, professional, direct, and with a look in her eyes that said she'd dealt with HOA overreach before. She arrived without the flashy car or clipboard showmanship, just a small satchel, a camera, and a legal pad. She walked James's property with practiced silence, marking every angle where a device could have been hidden. By the end of the visit, they'd found 2 more, both inactive but deliberately placed near the fence line. "This doesn't look like a misunderstanding," she told him. "It looks like surveillance." James gave her the binder he'd assembled, everything labeled in cross-reference pictures, emails, HOA notices, contractor statements, timestamps, and the warning he'd received after the state visit. Turned a few pages, nodded once, and said, "We'll handle it from here." But James knew that wasn't where it would end, because Karen was already preparing her counterattack at the next HOA meeting. James wasn't sure what to expect. The gatherings usually drew about 20 people. That night, over 40 showed up, neighbors who hadn't been to a meeting in years. Fold-out chairs filled the community center. Karen stood at the front like a politician on the brink of scandal, nervous, sharp, ready to twist anything that came her way. As soon as the meeting opened, Karen launched into a speech. She called the recent events unfortunate misunderstandings, claimed that the HOA had acted in the best interests of the neighborhood, said that James's home had been a material violation of community policy for years, and that the solar program was never fully disclosed. She glanced at James as she said that. Then she pulled out something unexpected, a grainy photo of his backyard, taken from behind a tree line. It was printed, laminated, and held up like evidence in a trial. Karen pointed. "This shows an unapproved structure extension that was never reported to the board. A clear violation. We believe there may be others." James didn't flinch, but inside, his hands were fists. She was escalating, digging for anything, fabricating if needed. Then Camille Ortiz stood from the back row. Karen faltered. "Excuse me," she said. "Only board members may address during opening statements." Camille held up a badge. "I'm not here to address the board. I'm here to serve notice." She walked to the front and placed a sealed envelope on the table before Karen. Everyone leaned in. Camille turned toward the group. "This is a formal advisory from the County Property Rights Office. We've received credible evidence of unauthorized surveillance devices placed on a private residence by or under direction of this HOA board. An investigation is ongoing." A quiet ripple moved through the room. Karen's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Camille continued. "Until that investigation is concluded, this board is advised to suspend all enforcement actions involving Mr. Carter's property. Further action without oversight could result in legal penalties, both civil and criminal." Karen tried to rally. "These are baseless accusations. Our HOA has always acted within the boundaries of our charter." Camille nodded. "Then you'll have nothing to worry about." Someone in the back chuckled. A few heads turned. The air shifted. James stood up. He didn't speak like Karen. No theatrics. No grandstanding. "I didn't want any of this," he said. "I just wanted my house, my roof, my right to live without being watched, harassed, or fined for things I didn't do. But I'm not going to sit quietly while someone tries to bury me in policy. Not anymore." He didn't wait for a response. He left the meeting in silence, but outside, someone followed. It was Ben, a neighbor from 2 streets over. Quiet guy, never involved. He caught up with James and said, "I think you should know. We had the same thing happen last year. HOA tried to stop our shed extension. They took pictures from behind our fence. I didn't think much of it until now." James looked at him. "You kept the photos?" Ben nodded. "In emails." More voices were rising. Whispers now, but soon they'd be statements. Karen had wanted to make an example out of James, but she was about to become one herself. It didn't take long for Ben's quiet admission to become the spark. Within a week of the HOA meeting, James found himself at the center of something bigger than he ever expected. 2 more neighbors came forward, Maggie from the cul-de-sac, and an older couple named the Harpers from down near the park entrance. Each had stories. Stories that sounded eerily familiar. Unauthorized photos taken from behind fences. Surprise citations for non-conforming paint tones that magically appeared after quiet disputes. One neighbor even found a microphone device in a landscaping rock near his back gate. Nothing issued, all too personal. What started as a personal property dispute had cracked open something ugly beneath the surface. This wasn't just a single overstep, it was a pattern. Karen had spent years cultivating power not through fairness or service, but through surveillance, fear, and silence. But now, silence was slipping. James didn't speak publicly about it. He didn't lead meetings. He didn't start a campaign. Instead, he gathered every affidavit, every incident log, every grainy cell phone, photo, or forwarded email. Camille from the county kept her investigation tight and professional, but James knew she was starting to piece it together too. This was no longer just about his roof. This was a civil overreach operation. And then came the letter. Delivered by courier, stamped with the state seal. The HOA was now the subject of a formal review for civil violations, pending a hearing with the Office of Local Governance. If found guilty, they could be fined, stripped of authority, and held liable for damages. The language was measured, the consequences were not. The HOA board tried to respond quickly, panicked emails, sudden reform memos, and calls for emergency meetings. But it was already too late. Word had spread beyond the neighborhood. A local paper picked up the story. HOA accused of illegal surveillance, state-backed homeowner fights back. Once it went online, the comments flooded in. Hundreds of people from across the state chimed in with similar experiences, stories about overreaching HOA boards, property threats, rogue enforcement. The article got shared, then syndicated. The story had become a storm. At the next board meeting, Karen tried to act composed. She stood with a stack of printouts, trying to deflect, recite policies, blame miscommunication. She called it a media stunt, a smear campaign. But for the first time, her words didn't land. The room was different. Dozens of residents, some who had never come before, sat silently, arms crossed, eyes hard. No one interrupted her. No one agreed with her either. And then came the moment no one expected. Alan Weaver, one of the board's longest-serving members and a quiet ally of Karen's, stood up. He'd always been the numbers guy, the one who read budget breakdowns and hosted the annual BBQ. But that night, he held a single-page petition. "I'm calling for a motion to vote on interim leadership," he said, effective immediately. Karen blinked. "You can't do that. We haven't even reviewed." "We have," he said. "We've reviewed everything. You've been running this place like a personal fiefdom. This stops tonight." He turned to the room. "All in favor of suspending the current board president pending outcome of the state hearing?" Hands went up. Not just a few. Nearly every single one. Even Maggie, even the Harpers, even Ben. Karen looked around, stunned. She tried to protest, but her voice was lost under the quiet shuffle of a room deciding it. Had finally had enough. The motion passed. Alan placed the gavel gently on the table and turned to her. "You're relieved, Karen?" Karen left the meeting that night without a word. No outbursts, no threats, just a cold, stunned silence as she walked down the aisle she used to command. But James wasn't celebrating, because as satisfying as it was, he knew Karen wasn't gone. Not yet. People like her didn't vanish. They retreated, waited, looked for loopholes, and judging by the strange van parked at the end of the block the next morning, she might already be working on her next move. The board was down, but the game wasn't over. Not until James made sure it ended. James noticed the van the same way he noticed everything else these days, quietly. It had no markings, just off-white paint and tinted windows. Parked at the far corner of the cul-de-sac facing his house that hadn't been there yesterday. Watched it from the edge of his porch while sipping his morning coffee. No movement, no engine hum, just the hum of suspicion. James didn't call anyone. Not yet. He'd learned patience, something Karen had underestimated from the start. By noon it was still there. At 3:15 after school let out, and the neighborhood returned to life, it pulled away. Slow, smooth, too careful. He caught the plate on his phone's zoom lens. Unregistered. Later that evening, James walked the perimeter of his house again. Nothing new, no new devices. But that didn't mean much. Karen was clever, and clearly not finished. Then came the knock. It was Alan Weaver, board treasurer, now acting president. He stood on the porch with two folded papers and a face full of second thoughts. "We got something strange," Alan said. "Came in the mail today, addressed to the board, but no return address. Inside were surveillance photos, grainy shots of your yard, your front door, one of you in the attic, I think." James didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Alan continued. "No notes, no threats, just pictures. Like someone was trying to make a point." He handed over one of the pages. James recognized it instantly. It was taken from the exact height and angle of the same window that had faced the van. Someone had been watching, up close, and they wanted him to know. "You think this was Karen?" Alan asked. James stared at the image. "I think it was someone who wants me to believe she's still in control. State hearings next week," Alan added. "If this is a scare tactic, it's a desperate one." James didn't respond. His eyes were already scanning the lines, the timestamp in the corner, the slight bend in the paper. Something about the layout was off, too professional, too deliberate. Karen had slipped once. She'd authorized surveillance, planted trackers, and fumbled her defense. But this wasn't her style. It wasn't control. It was chaos. The kind that came when someone else took the reins. That night, James made a decision. He returned to his attic, grabbed the remaining devices he'd collected, and dropped them in a sealed container. Then he opened the drawer where he kept the spare keys. He pulled out a small USB drive, one Stacy had given him weeks ago. "Just in case," she'd said. "If this gets worse." Inside were encrypted audio recordings from the state investigation, interviews with neighbors, HOA meeting. Excerpts, legal commentary, enough to make a full picture if things went public. James uploaded a copy to a secure cloud account, and then he waited. The hearing was set for Thursday, Wednesday afternoon. An anonymous email arrived in his inbox. No sender, no message. Just a single attachment, a voice recording. He played it once. Karen's voice, muffled but unmistakable. He's turning them all against me. If the board won't fix it, I'll find someone who will. Another voice replied low, male, unfamiliar. Won't listen, Karen again. Then scare him. Make him. The clip ended. James sat still for a long time. He could feel the shift now. This wasn't about fines anymore, or property lines. This had turned into something else, something unspoken. Deeper. By 8 p.m., he was on the phone with Camille. By 9 p.m., she had state legal counsel on the line. By 10, an official request to fast-track the hearing was filed. This time, it wasn't just civil overreach, it was personal intimidation. Potential conspiracy, abuse of position. The stakes had escalated and James had the evidence to prove it, but what he didn't know, what no one knew was that Karen had one last move left. A letter, already sent. Not to James, but to the State Historical Preservation Office, claiming his roof work had violated a protected residential designation filed 6 months earlier, filed under his name, but without his signature. The trap had been set long before the panels ever came down, and James was about to find out that the damage wasn't just above his head, it had already crept beneath his foundation. Thursday morning arrived with no ceremony. The sky over Willow Bend was a blank sheet of gray, the air thick with a silence that seemed to know what was coming. James Carter stood by his window, waiting for the ride that would take him to the county offices. The state hearing wasn't just about one roof anymore. It was about how far someone like Karen Whitmore would go to hold on to control land. What it would take to finally stop her. By 10 a.m., James sat in the third row of a medium-sized conference room. Camille Ortiz sat beside him, her expression unreadable. At the front, a panel of 3 officials reviewed folders, digital evidence, and complaints from no fewer than 7 residents of Willow Bend. Karen sat across the room, alone, hands folded neatly on a leather binder. Her expression never changed. The room settled, and the hearing began. It started predictably. Formal statements, recounting of violations, photos of James's roof before and after removal, audio evidence of HOA meetings. Then came the testimony. Ben, the Harpers, Maggie, they all spoke, detailing harassment, unauthorized citations, and the eerie presence of surveillance on their private property. James gave his statement last. Calm, direct, methodical. He explained the morning his roof was torn apart, the planted tracking devices, the photos that followed, and finally, the voice recording that revealed something deeper. Karen had intended to scare him into submission. At that moment, the room shifted. The panel leaned in. No longer bureaucrats reviewing property lines. Now they were investigators, and Karen felt it. She requested a recess. It was denied. When the panel turned to Karen for her statement, she stood slowly, with the poise of someone who still believed they could talk their way out. She didn't deny the roof removal. She didn't deny the surveillance. Instead, she claimed it was all a misunderstanding of enforcement duties, a case of poor communication. She pivoted, as expected, to James. He's been targeting me, she said, twisting facts, riling up neighbors. This is not about property, it's a campaign against the HOA. Then she reached into her binder and produced the final card she had left to play, a certified letter from the State Historical Preservation Office. The panel took it. Read it. Karen cleared her throat. Double quotes. Mr. Carter's house was flagged for historical review earlier this year, she said. That designation restricts major exterior changes including roof replacement. His new construction violates state conservation guidelines. James blinked. That's not possible. I never filed for historical status. Karen smiled small tight. But the application was submitted, under your name, with your address. And it was approved. The panel checked the letter again. James saw their brows tighten. Camille asked to see the application form. One of the panelists pulled it up. And there it was. James's name, his address, a digital signature he didn't recognize. Karen sat back, satisfied. For a moment, she believed she'd turned the entire hearing on its head, until Camille leaned forward. We have a digital forensics team. Would you mind if we verify the source of this application? Karen hesitated. Why would I mind? It's his application. Camille nodded. Within minutes, an IT representative entered the room and traced the application's metadata using the state's internal network. The panel fell silent. As the results came in, the application had been filed from a private IP address to a residential router, registered to Karen Whitmore's home. The room didn't explode. It sank, slowly, heavily, under the weight of what that meant. She hadn't just overreached. She had committed fraud, filed a false application under someone else's name, weaponized the preservation office to trap James in a violation she manufactured. Herself. Karen didn't speak. She didn't move. The hearing concluded. 30 minutes later, The HOA board was placed under state oversight pending reorganization. Karen was formally removed from all positions, fined, and referred for possible criminal charges. Surveillance equipment was seized. James was cleared of all violations. His property restoration would be covered entirely by the state and the HOA's insurance fund, but that wasn't the part that lingered. What stayed with James was walking out of the building and seeing his neighbors silent at first, then nodding, then shaking his hand. Not just for what he'd won, but because someone had finally stood up to the quiet tyranny they'd all come to accept. That night, James returned to his home, his roof whole again, his panels back in place. The van never returned, and her house sat dark and empty 2 weeks later. For sale sign out front. No one waved as the moving truck pulled away. Somewhere in the silence of Willow Bend, balance returned, but James never stopped checking the corners of his house. Because once you've seen how deep control can go, how easily power can twist you, never really stop looking over your shoulder. Not completely.